That is a perfect introduction. Let's just go with it because that has kind of been the uh, unofficial philosophy of my existence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share just a little bit briefly of my own kind of personal journey and what led me to what I'm doing now, which is inexplicable and amazing even to me or anyone who ever taught me English or had instructed me in any kind of educational approach in life, or guidance counselors, or anyone who ever knew me as a person even 10 years ago. And the fact that I'm writing spiritual poetry and having these kind of interactions with people on social media. I so I should explain. I was born here in I'm a fourth generation Wyomingite. My great grandfather came here in 1885 and opened up a pharmacy that stayed in existence until 2007. So our family is, my great grandfather was a pharmacist, very serious, no nonsense guy. My grandfather, another pharmacist, lab coat, very serious, no nonsense guy. My dad, pharmacist, very serious, no nonsense guy. Uh, then there's me, that seemed to be born as like an alien child to this collection of scientists and mathematicians. My mom was a single room schoolhouse teacher with the ruler in her hand, and very, very loving. My parents were very loving, but they were they things like poetry or sharing personal details of your life with strangers. For them right now, I have no doubt they are having a shot of celestial whiskey wherever they are, as they know I'm doing this today. I was born and raised Catholic. In fact, for a time, I actually worked at a Catholic church like 2.5 lifetimes ago, it seems like. Um, and my spiritual life growing up and my general life was very easy. I had an easy childhood. I had like if I was a video game, everything was set to beginner. Like I didn't really struggle. We were a middle class family. We always had food on the table. I had one brother 4 years older than me who's also a scientist. He's working for Xbox, making computer chips and doing things that he tries to explain to me every day. And I can't understand what in the heck he's doing. Like I don't understand what he does. And he works in virtual reality and makes things that appear in real life. It's voodoo to me. I don't understand it. But so I had a very easy, uncomplicated life growing up. And it wasn't until I got into my mid-20s when I noticed things started becoming harder for me. Started on the inside, probably in my heart. I started having a hard time, even in college, getting out of bed. And I couldn't quite explain why I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. My body was like, no, you shouldn't get out of bed. My brain would say, no, bed is safer. And it kind of started there, very simple. It's like a paper cut that I ignored. And as years went on, the paper cut got bigger and bigger, and life became harder and harder. Before, it was an unseen reason why I felt sad and melancholy. But then things started becoming more difficult. I was telling my parents a real quick story. I was going to tell my parents I was going to move to Chicago. It was my junior year in college. I was going to move to Chicago and I was going to join Second City Comedy. The only thing I was good at in college or school was really making people laugh during class. It was kind of a captive audience for me, kind of like you guys are today. And let me just say this. I am so honored and grateful to be among this community of people. David, your music was perfect. It really relaxed me. I've done a few of these calls, and a lot of times you can tell within the first 2 or 3 minutes of just people gathering around and talking what it's going to be like. And I'll say two things. One, from the very beginning, when we had a long, what I felt was a perfectly long conversation on chocolates and brownies being put into M&Ms and Snickers, the fact that we had that conversation, I thought that was perfect. This is the kind of people I want to spend a Sunday morning with, talking about things like this. And then David, your music and just the energy of this community, I am very, very grateful to be here. I'm very, very honored to be here with all of you. And so when life started becoming harder for me in my 20s, my wife and I met when we were in high school. Again, very uncomplicated life. My wife and I met when we were 15. We started dating when we were 17, and we've been together since. So I've never really had my heart broken. I've never really had anything set me back in life. All I did is I went to church with my parents every Sunday. I was a good boy. I deposited all my prayers in the perfect places they're supposed to go. I was told that eventually I would be able to cash out those prayers for gifts and prizes later on in my life. And so I was prepared for that. So when life started becoming more difficult, when I was telling my parents I was going to move to Chicago as my junior year in college, I was going to drop out of college and go to Second City Comedy so I could eventually join Chevy Chase and Jim Belushi and all those guys in Saturday Night Live. I practiced this conversation with my dad for about a week before. It was Thanksgiving break, and I was home, and I was going to explain to him that I was dropping out of college, which would kill him, and then I'd resuscitate him to let him know, but I'm going to go and be a comedian, which would kill him again. So I had prepared this whole talk of how I was going to do this, and he knocked on my bedroom door, and he never really knocked before. It was the first time I remember him knocking, and he came in, and before I could say anything, he explained to me that he had cancer, and it was very, very serious, and he probably didn't have very long. I was 21 at this time, 22, and he was going to need me to drop out of school and to come back and help run our family business. And he wasn't commanding it. It was more of like, your mom they were fairly older, and my mom would need help running the store. And so in that moment, I said, yes, of course, I would do that. And so I stayed with my dad for about, my parents for about a year, and then he passed away. And then about 10 years after that, the store closed, which was another form of grief. And then my mom died about a year later after that. And all the while, my wife and I were raising our firstborn son, who was diagnosed with autism early on. So I had my experience of that early on. I remain a recovering narcissist. I imagine anyone who likes to hear themselves speak a lot, or write things that they think people want to listen to. There's a little bit of healthy narcissism, a vein still rushing through me. But my early acceptance of my son's autism diagnosis was more grief. And I grieved the life of my son, who was sitting right here on my lap at the time. He couldn't speak. He couldn't really communicate. He didn't seem to interact with the world that we were part of. And so I was grieving him. I was grieving the loss of our family store. That was my identity at this point, because I didn't know who I was. I was going to be a person who stayed home, taking care of his parents and taking care of his store, and those things went away. And so those little paper cut sadness I had when I was in my early 20s that I experienced was now by the time I was 30 and wide open scar, a wound that wouldn't scar. And I remember I would go to church and I would pray, and people would tell me, oh, you just have to pray harder. You're not praying the right way. Here's the algebra equation for you to pray. If you do this 7 times, it should work. It worked for my aunt. Then I would hear stories about this. This is what you need to do. God needs you to do this in order to be heard. And so I would try those things. I would try to cash all those checks I had written years ago in my Catholic upbringing, and nothing came. Nothing that I was praying for seemed to happen. And of course, I was praying for things to change instead of me changing at the time. But it felt like I was going to a well that had no water, and I kept drawing empty buckets. And so I did what any rational middle-aged man does. By the time 2015 rolled around, I had given up all spiritual practices. I wasn't a writer at this point. I didn't really know what it was. Our store had closed. Our autistic son was now getting close to in high school, and he had worked so hard and done so much work that he didn't really need his dad anymore. He had overcome every expectation any doctor or anyone had ever placed on him. And all of a sudden, okay, now I wasn't here helping run a family business. No, I wasn't here helping taking care of my parents. No, I wasn't a special need dad anymore. And I didn't know what I was. I didn't feel Catholic anymore. I was completely untethered to all these institutions and things in my mind that I thought I was here on this earth for. And so I did what any rational middle-aged man does. I went to Facebook and I started having fake conversations with God on Facebook. And I did this for a couple reasons. One, I was poking fun in a way at people who were telling me, giving me faith and spiritual advice about how I could get out of this forest I was in. Because people could recognize I wasn't the same person I had been, and I had lost a lot of my joy. So they were giving me, pray this, do this. And so I was a little bit mad about all the spiritual advice I was giving. So I was going to poke fun at that with these conversations. And I was also poking fun at the self-help community because I was reading any self-help book I could find, like 10 steps to a better me, 15 steps to a no beer belly, 25 steps to look like Jude Law, whatever the steps were I was trying to do. And it was all, nothing was working. So I started having these fake conversations with God on Facebook. And I did it as a way of being flippant and funny and trying to kind of point out the ridiculousness of kind of everything. And it was great at first. God and I would have conversations about why I shouldn't wear skinny jeans. We talked about what was on TV the night before, how to make the perfect risotto. They were very benign conversations. And then every now and then I would accidentally let something really true and slip in these conversations. I would talk about me having depression. And that wasn't something I'd ever said before. In my own mind, I didn't think I was depressed. I just knew I wasn't quite myself. But I had never said that before. I had gone to therapists, and which they introduced it to me. And I was like, no, that's not me, that's somebody else. It wasn't something I had ever thought about before. But suddenly I had written it down on Facebook in this conversation. And I couldn't believe I was writing. I was finally connecting with all these wounds inside of me. I was talking about my mental health. Every now and then it would slip out. And every time I did, all of a sudden people, strangers, not just my friends and family who were giving me sympathy likes or whatnot. There was friends and family who were doing that, but it was strangers reaching out to me saying, I felt that same way too. I feel lost and empty right now as well. And I was only going to do 40 of these conversations. And then a year later, I was at like 500 of them. And the conversation started talking more about what it was like to raise a child in need, or what it was like to grieve the loss of a loved one, or what it's like to be a 40-year-old who thought he was this good boy Catholic, going to be Catholic his whole life, and all of a sudden completely floating around like a feather in the breeze, not attached to anything anymore. And it was a real time, these conversations were real time where I was in my spiritual and emotional life. And the more vulnerable I was, the more people started following and started talking about, I have felt that exact same way too. And it wasn't that I was writing anything that was groundbreaking or amazing. I think what I was doing, I was giving permission for people to say those things to themselves that I wasn't saying to myself until I wrote it down. Giving people permission to say, it's okay to be lost. It's okay to have a faith crisis. I say that sometimes to groups and they get uncomfortable with the fact that I'm still, even though years later, I'm still in a faith crisis, and I embrace it and I love it, because crisis means I've been curious, I've been desperate to look for God in places that I couldn't find God previously. I embrace my doubts that came. I embrace all these things because it leads me to look for different wells to pull water from. And so I would have these conversations, and eventually now, 6 years later, I've had 2,200 of these conversations with God on Facebook. And I'm getting people from all sorts of walks of life, people who are atheists, people who are Christian, whatever the religious background they come from. And people seem to all be struggling with the same thing. They're feeling more and more untethered to things that they once were connected to and believed in. And I think in a lot of ways, that means people are reaching and searching for things. And that's amazing, because we're like the candy industry. We're not stagnant. We're constantly evolving. We're constantly looking for new ways. God is constantly trying to find new ways to connect with us. So I was having these conversations thinking I was going to shut them down and be done with them after I got to a certain point. And then over time, the conversations really stopped just being back and forth. I started writing poetry, and I had never read poetry. I had never studied poetry. I didn't particularly like it myself, but I found these responses that God was writing were poetic and lyrical in response. And I find that anyone who knows me in the real life would be like, anyone who knows me in the real life and reads what I write and then bumps into me on the street, which is usually super uncomfortable because I live in a small town. And when you bare your soul and heart and showing that you're vulnerable and you're not a perfect person, Facebook was created to show that we're all perfect and we have amazing families that never have a hair out of place, and our meals are always something for the Food Network. And here I was writing about depression and grief and all these things, the kind of the checkered parts of my heart. And it makes people uncomfortable in real life when you talk to them about it. Certainly people who knew me growing up as a class clown, and they would ask me, where are these poems coming from? And I don't know. But as I know is the faucet turned on, and I'm going to keep writing as much poetry I can until it turns off. One of these days, I'm assuming it's going to turn off because it kind of turned on out of nowhere. So I spend my days writing as much as I can. And every time I write something, it always seems like I'm learning something new about myself. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I don't really know what it is I'm doing or who I am, but I know my spiritual life is much more connected than it's ever been in my life. It feels a lot more true. It doesn't feel like I'm jumping through hoops or putting together an abacus of prayers and sliding things over, and I did that right, so I should be good. No, it feels now it's more of a relationship with the divine. I feel more connected to spirit than I've ever felt before. And the more I write, the more connected I feel. So I'm going to share a few of these poems that I've written in the last year that kind of show a little bit of my journey that I've been on. And I hope they speak to you. I don't name my poems. My wife will tell you, we've had 3 children. I've been in the room for all 3 births of our children, and I am no help at all. Literally, I'm zero help in the room, except for the fact that I'm really good at, going to get ice chips and, helping count to 10. But aside from that, that's where my skill set ended. And the one place I'm really terrible at is naming things. My wife will tell you I was zero help naming any of our children because I feel like, I don't know, they're still works in progress. Maybe they're named Jack now, but in 20 years, they might be something else. Like, let's just not officially name anybody until we kind of get their personality. But that didn't work for, the legal system or the hospital or my wife or just about anyone else I've ever met in general. But I've applied that to my poetry. I don't name my poems. I just say this is the next one because they're constantly covered in wet paint. And so I'm still working on them. But we'll just call this poem number 1. Lately, when I need to pray, I go to a church that has no doors and where the walls are made of carved granite. I sit under its moving roof on a pew that smells like fresh pine, and I fold my hands quietly until God joins me. Here in this most ancient of churches, I watch a dozen fat rainbow angels shaped as trout dance in the baptismal font in front of me. And I wonder if I too will be made anew. There is a special kind of holy quiet here that rings much louder than any booming church bell I've ever heard before, and the silence, well, it always rattles my ribs. Its choir loft is high up in a bird's nest, and its confessional is a breeze that asks me to speak my sins. And I do. And they're carried away into the mystic. The longer I sing psalms in this church, the shorter my memory of all my past mistakes become, and that's when the voice of love speaks to me. O tired light, O wounded heart, O my child of crumbling grace, come plant your feet in this Eden, come rest in this sacred space. O weary traveler, O somber fire, O shaking heart that is prone to fear, come lay in my ribboned water, come to know that I'm right here. O wilting daisy, O dying star, O broken song that needs a name, come sit with me among the wild, and then you'll never be the same. God and I take turns saying everything we need to speak to one another. I say things in short, heavy, jagged breaths, and God speaks in thin, long pauses, and this goes on until the sun begins to set. And that's when it's time to leave. And even though I go home, I'm always still there in this antiquated church of trees and valleys where foxes are lectors and horizons are steeples and clouds are vestibules, where campfires are incense, where time is a gospel, where the great flow is a sacrament, where the forests are community, where a little piece of me always will still remain. Talking to the voice of whispering love, as I watch trout become slain in the spirit, and I can't stop marveling at the altar of creation. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm looking for God outside of pews and outside of buildings, and more in people, and more among the wind passing through the pines, or watching water move in nature. So I thought, as an improviser, I do teach improv, and I do that at a community, and I've performed improv before. Once I heard David's songs this morning, I swapped out one of my poems, and I'm going to do a quick one that I think that I feel is speaking more today than the one I had selected. And this is what we call in the industry a pause, a dramatic pause while I look for that exact poem. But here I come. I fell through a hole in a church pew yesterday, and I landed right in the thick amber field of a piece of stained glass. I asked a red saint who was stargazing, "Why do I have to suffer?" Without looking at me, he said, "To know God." I didn't like that answer. So I crawled through a mist of royal triangles and swam across a sea of ovals and scaled a pointed cusp until I found a glowing sinner. And I asked her the same question. Why must I suffer? She placed her green hand on my purple cheek and sung, because a broken heart is easier to share. And suddenly my hands became turquoise doves, and my lips became yellow vines, and my feet became fat red rubies, and I became radiant painted glass of the divine. I became reflected light, and everything I touched glowed. And now my broken illuminated heart colors the wall of every room that I walk into. And so I will read one last poem. And this was one I write. I don't write in a way to, I don't edit. I let kind of crowdsourcing edit for me. I'll write a poem, and then I'll let people tell me that either doesn't make sense or I misspelled things. It's how I save on editing costs. But a couple of months ago, I wrote a poem. I was in the middle, it was one of those, if you've ever had one of those days where you wake up and you just don't feel right and you feel tense, but you can't put your finger on exactly why. And that's 90% of my experience with my own emotional and mental health, is where I just don't feel great, but I can't exactly know. There isn't like a reason why. It's just kind of it's just a weight, an unseen weight that I can't put my finger on. And so a couple months ago, I had to pick my wife up from work. We're a single car family, and I knew I only had 25 minutes, but oftentimes I need to get a poem out or something out just so I can feel better and try to figure out what it is that's bothering me. So I had 25 minutes, and I wrote this poem. And in my experience, and if you're a writer, don't ever do this. This is a terrible thing to do. I immediately put all my work onto Facebook as soon as I'm done with it, because if I wait too long, I'll worry about it, and then I'll overthink it, and then I'll think, what is my neighbor going to think about that, or what is whatever. If I just post it right away, I get rid of all of that. So that's what I did. I wrote this poem. I had 25 minutes, and so I got it done. I closed my laptop, and I felt better immediately. I drove across town. I picked up my wife, and then about 8 hours later, I looked at Facebook again, and it had been shared 1,000 times. And then within like a week, it had been shared 100,000 times. And it wasn't something that I wrote to impress anyone. It wasn't something I wrote I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I just knew I needed to say this poem. And so I could feel better. But it seemed like it connected with a lot of people who were maybe feeling the same way that I was in that time. And we'll just call this poem number 3. My brain and my heart divorced a decade ago over who is to blame about how big of a mess I've become. Eventually, they couldn't be in the same room with each other. Now my head and my heart share custody of me. I stay with my brain during the week, and my heart gets me on weekends, but they never speak to each other. Instead, they just give me the same note to pass to each other every week. And the notes they send to one another, well, they always say the same thing. They say, "This is all your fault." On Sundays, my heart complains about all the times my head has let me down in the past. And on Wednesdays, my head lists all the times my heart has screwed things up for me in the future. They blame each other for the state of my life. There's been a lot of yelling and crying lately. So I've been spending a lot more time with my gut, who kind of serves as my unofficial therapist. Most nights, I sneak out of the window in my rib cage and I slide down my spine and collapse on my gut's plush leather chair that's always open for me. And I just sit until the sun comes up. But last evening, my gut asked me if I was having a hard time being caught between my head and my heart. I nodded. I said, I didn't know if I could live with either of them anymore. My heart is always sad about something that happened yesterday, while my head is always worried about something that might happen tomorrow, I lamented. My gut just squeezed my hand, but I continued. I just can't live with my mistakes of the past or my deep anxiety about the future. My gut smiled at me and said, in that case, I think you should go stay with your lungs for a while. I was confused. The look on my face gave it away, but my gut said, if you're exhausted about your heart's obsession with the fixed past and your mind's focus on an uncertain future, then your lungs are the perfect place for you. There's no yesterday in your lungs. There's no tomorrow there either. There's only now. There's only inhale. There's only exhale. There is only this moment. There is only breath. And in that breath, you can rest while your heart and your head work out their relationship. So this morning, while my brain was busy reading tea leaves, and while my heart was staring at old photographs, I packed up a little bag and I walked to the door of my lungs. And before I could even knock, she opened the door, and with a smile and as a gust of wind embraced me, she said, what took you so long? Again, I am so honored to have been here to share a little bit of my story and to share a little bit of my words. Honestly, the energy in this group, I feel so blessed to be connected with you guys and to know you now. And I'm just really honored to have been here. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.